My name is Claire Bennett, and I'm 58 years old. The night I discovered my mother living in a freezing garage changed everything I thought I knew about my own daughter. It was a cold November evening in suburban Portland, Oregon, and I'd driven over to Bethany's house unannounced because she hadn't returned my calls in 2 weeks. The sprawling 2-story home with its manicured lawn and 3-car garage looked perfect from the outside, just like Bethany's life always seemed. But when I heard strange shuffling noises coming from the detached garage around 9 that night, curiosity pulled me toward that side door. I opened it expecting to find stored holiday decorations or maybe my son-in-law's workshop. Instead, I found my 79-year-old mother wrapped in threadbare blankets, sleeping on a camping cot surrounded by cardboard boxes and plastic bins. The space heater in the corner barely fought off the cold that made my breath fog. Mom looked up at me with hollow eyes and whispered 5 words that shattered my world. "Please don't tell your sister. Before I tell you what happened next, I need to know where you're watching this from. Drop your city or country in the comments because this story needs to be heard everywhere. And please, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel because what my son did to my son-in-law needs to reach every family out there. Trust me. You won't believe where this goes." I stood frozen in that doorway for what felt like an eternity, my brain unable to process what my eyes were seeing. Dorothy Bennett, my mother, the woman who raised 3 children and worked as a nurse for 40 years, was living in conditions I wouldn't house a dog in. The garage wasn't insulated. There was no bathroom, just a portable toilet hidden behind a flimsy curtain in the corner. A small folding table held her medications, some of which I could see were expired based on the dates on the bottles. Her clothes were stuffed into plastic storage bins stacked against the wall. This wasn't temporary. This was someone's living situation, and it had been for long enough that Shed organized her meager belongings into some semblance of order. When I finally found my voice, it came out as a strangled whisper. "Mom, how long have you been out here?" She pulled the blankets tighter around her shoulders, and I noticed how much weight Shed lost. Her cheekbones stood out sharp against her papery skin, and her hands trembled from more than just the cold. 6 months, sweetheart," she said, and the resignation in her voice made me want to scream. Bethany and Richard said it was the only way. They needed the guest room for Richard's home office, and they said I was lucky to have a roof over my head at all. Lucky. The word tasted like poison in my mouth. This was my daughter's doing. My Bethany, who I'd raised to be compassionate and strong, had put her own grandmother in a garage like unwanted furniture. I knelt beside the cot, my knees hitting the cold concrete floor, and took my mother's icy hands in mine. "Tell me everything, Mom. I need to know all of it." And she did. The story came out in painful, halting sentences. Bethany and her husband Richard had convinced Mom 6 months ago that she couldn't live independently anymore. They'd painted a terrifying picture of state nursing homes and Medicaid facilities where Shed be warehoused and forgotten. They'd offered her this arrangement as a kindness, they said. She could stay close to family, help with the grandchildren, and maintain her independence. All she had to do was pay $800 a month in rent, $800 to sleep on a cot in an unheated garage. The worst part was the sneaking. Mom explained that she wasn't allowed in the main house except to use the bathroom, and only during specific hours when Richard said it was okay. She had to wait until everyone was asleep to wash herself at the utility sink. She ate her meals out here, usually whatever leftovers Bethany brought out in plastic containers. She hadn't eaten dinner with the family in months. The grandchildren, 8-year-old Madison and 6-year-old Chase, had been told that Grandma Dot preferred the privacy of the garage. They'd been taught not to bother her too much. As Mom talked, I noticed other things. Her wedding ring was missing from her finger. The gold bracelet my father had given her on their 30th anniversary was gone. The pearl necklace that had belonged to her mother, passed down through 3 generations, was nowhere to be seen. When I asked about them, Mom's face crumpled. Bethany borrowed them 6 months ago. She said she needed to get them appraised for insurance purposes. I haven't seen them since. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just neglect. This was theft. I helped Mom to her feet, ignoring her protests. "We're going inside right now, and you're going to pack whatever you need because you're coming home with me tonight." She shook her head frantically, fear flashing in her eyes. "Claire, no, you don't understand. Richard said if I caused trouble, he'd have me declared incompetent and put in a state facility. Bethany has power of attorney, over my finances. They control everything. Power of attorney. The words hit me like a physical blow. When had that happened? Why hadn't anyone told me? I marched toward the door connecting the garage to the main house, Mom trailing behind me and begging me to stop. I didn't stop. I burst through that door into Bethany's gleaming kitchen, with its granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, everything perfect and pristine. And I started shouting my daughter's name. Bethany appeared at the top of the stairs in her designer pajamas, her face going pale when she saw me. "Mom? What are you doing here?" Her voice was small, guilty. The voice of a child caught doing something wrong. Richard appeared behind her, his expression hardening instantly. He was a tall man, athletic, with the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. "Claire, this is a private residence. You need to leave." I ignored him and focused on my daughter. "Bethany Marie, you look me in the eye right now and tell me why your grandmother is living in your garage." Bethany couldn't do it. She looked at her feet, at the walls, anywhere but at me. Richard, however, had no such problem. He came down the stairs slowly, deliberately, inserting himself between me and Bethany like a barrier. "Your mother agreed to this arrangement. She signed a contract. The garage is weatherproofed and has heating." I pointed at the pathetic space heater I could still see through the open door. "That's not heating, Richard. That's a fire hazard, and weatherproofed? It's 40 degrees in there." He shrugged, unmoved. "Dot is difficult. She complains constantly. We tried having her in the house, but it didn't work out. This arrangement suits everyone. And frankly, Claire, it's none of your business. You haven't exactly been around to help with her care, have you?" The accusation stung because there was a grain of truth to it. I'd been dealing with my own divorce 3 years ago, rebuilding my life. And yes, I'd let Bethany take the lead on Mom's care. I'd trusted my daughter. That trust now felt like the biggest mistake of my life. "I'm taking her home with me tonight," I said, my voice steady, despite the rage shaking through my body. "And then we're going to talk about that power of attorney and exactly where Mom's money has been going." Richard's face twitched. Just slightly. But it was enough. He knew I was onto something. "You can't just take her. We have legal custody of her affairs." I pulled out my phone. "Then I guess, well, let the police sort it out. I'm sure they'd love to hear about the living conditions you've subjected a 79-year-old woman to." That got Bethany moving. She pushed past Richard and grabbed my arm. "Mom, please, don't call the police. Just let me explain." But she didn't explain. She just stood there crying while Richard stared at me with cold calculation in his eyes. I went back to the garage, helped Mom gather her few possessions into 2 small suitcases, and walked her out to my car. Bethany stood in the doorway of the house, tears streaming down her face, but she didn't try to stop us. Richard stood behind her with his arms crossed, and I swear I saw him smirk as we drove away. His expression said what his mouth didn't. "She'll be back when you realize how hard it is." He had no idea what was coming for him. My apartment in the city wasn't much, just a modest 2-bedroom place I'd rented after my divorce from Garrett. But it was warm and clean, and most importantly, it was safe. I got Mom settled in the guest room, piling blankets on the bed and cranking up the heat until the whole apartment felt like summer. She sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing her coat, looking lost and small in a way that broke my heart. I made her soup and tea, watched her eat slowly, and tried to wrap my head around how this had happened. How had my mother's life been reduced to a camping cot in a garage while my daughter lived in luxury? After Mom fell asleep, I went through the documents Shed managed to keep hidden in the garage. She'd been smart enough to make copies of her bank statements and hide them in a folder at the bottom of one of her storage bins. What I found in those statements made my blood run cold. This wasn't just about the garage. This was systematic financial abuse. Over the past 18 months, Bethany had made withdrawal after withdrawal from Mom's accounts. $15,000 for a kitchen renovation, $8,000 for Madison's private school tuition, $12,000 for a family vacation to Hawaii that Mom hadn't been invited on. The monthly rent payments of $800 plus an additional $300 for utilities, even though the garage had no utilities to speak of. I did the math 3 times because I couldn't believe it. My father had left Mom $85,000 in life insurance when he died 5 years ago. It was supposed to be her security, her safety net for medical expenses, and end-of-life care. According to these statements, only $22,000 remained. Bethany and Richard had burned through $63,000 of my mother's money in less than 2 years. The realization made me physically sick. I barely made it to the bathroom before I threw up. The next morning, I called the one person I thought might help. My brother Frank was 4 years older than me, a contractor who lived in Bend with his second wife. We hadn't been particularly close since our father died, but he was still family, and I thought he'd care about what was happening to Mom. I was wrong. When I explained the situation, Frank's response was measured, careful, and completely unhelpful. "Claire, you need to be rational about this. Bethany and Richard have been taking care of Mom for 2 years. Do you know how much work that is? How much it costs? Maybe they did borrow some money from her accounts. But it was for her benefit too. She lives with them, doesn't she? She lives in their garage, Frank. In a space with no insulation and no bathroom." There was a long pause. "Well, I'm sure there's more to the story. Richard's a good guy. He loaned me some money last year when my business was struggling. I can't just take sides against him." And there it was. Richard had bought my brother's loyalty with a loan. I wondered how much it had cost. I wondered how many people in my family Richard had managed to manipulate with his money and his charm. I spent the next 3 days gathering evidence while Mom rested and started to regain some strength. I took her to my doctor for a full checkup. Dr. Martinez was horrified by what she found. Mom was malnourished, anemic, and showing signs of vitamin D deficiency from spending months in that dark garage with minimal sunlight. Her arthritis medications had been withheld or given inconsistently. She'd lost 17 pounds in 6 months. Dr. Martinez documented everything in a detailed report and gave me the name of an elder law attorney She'd worked with on previous abuse cases. Gloria Martinez, no relation to the doctor, was a sharp-eyed woman in her early 50s who specialized in elder abuse cases. She sat across from me in her downtown office, reading through the bank statements and medical reports with increasing anger. "This is one of the clearest cases of financial exploitation I've seen," she said. "The power of attorney your mother signed gives Bethany control over her finances, but it doesn't give her permission to steal. And combined with the living conditions, this is criminal elder abuse." Criminal. The word hung in the air between us. My daughter could go to jail for this. Gloria filed paperwork immediately to revoke the power of attorney and freeze Mom's remaining accounts. It would take a few days for the courts to process everything, but at least we could stop the bleeding. She also advised me to document everything, take photos, gather witnesses, and prepare for Richard to fight back hard. "Men like your son-in-law don't give up control easily," she warned. "He's going to come at you with everything he has. Are you ready for that?" I thought about my mother's hollow eyes in that garage. I thought about the smirk on Richard's face as we drove away. "I'm ready," I told her. I reached out to my other child, my son Marcus, who lived in Seattle and worked for some tech company I barely understood. Marcus was 32, single, and more focused on his career than family drama, which was probably why he'd been able to maintain a cordial relationship with both Bethany and me, despite the tension that had grown between us over the years. When I called him and explained what he'd found, his first reaction was disbelief. "Mom, that doesn't sound like Bethany. Are you sure you're not overreacting? Maybe Grandma Dot's memory isn't great. Maybe she's confused about the finances." "Marcus, I have bank statements. I have photos. Your grandmother was living in a garage, and your sister stole $63,000 from her." Silence on the other end of the line. Then, "I visited Bethany like 3 months ago. I saw the garage. It looked fine. Bethany said Grandma Dot wanted the privacy because she didn't like the noise from the kids." My heart sank. Richard and Bethany had already gotten to Marcus, had already spun their story in a way that made this seem reasonable. "Your grandmother didn't want privacy. She was exiled. There's a difference." Marcus promised to think about it, to maybe drive down from Seattle in a few weeks to see Mom himself. It wasn't the immediate support he'd hoped for, but at least he was willing to consider that I might be telling the truth. That was something. What I didn't know then was that Richard had already anticipated my moves. While I was gathering evidence and talking to lawyers, he was preparing his counterattack, and when it came hard and fast, and nearly destroyed everything. 3 days after I brought Mom home, Bethany and Richard showed up at my apartment. I heard the pounding on the door and opened it to find Richard's face red with rage and Bethany standing slightly behind him, her eyes swollen from crying. "You kidnapped my mother-in-law," Richard said before I could even speak. "I want her returned immediately, or I'm calling the police." I stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind me, not wanting Mom to hear this. She left willingly. She's a grown woman who can make her own decisions. Richard pulled out a folder from under his arm and thrust it at me. "Not according to this. We have medical documentation that Dorothy is experiencing cognitive decline. Early dementia. She needs supervised care. And we're her legal guardians through the power of attorney. What you did is kidnapping. And if you don't return her by end of business today, I'm filing charges." I opened the folder, hands shaking, and looked at what appeared to be a doctor's assessment of my mother's mental state. It suggested memory problems, confusion, and potential incompetence to manage her own affairs. The signature at the bottom belonged to a doctor, Wesley Grant, someone I'd never heard of. "This is fake," I said, my voice steady despite the fear crawling up my spine. "My mother was just evaluated by Dr. Martinez, and she's completely competent." Richard smiled, and it was the coldest smile I'd ever seen. "That's your opinion. We have documentation from an actual specialist. Now, I'm going to give you one more chance to do this the easy way before I make this very difficult for you." Bethany finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Mom, please, just let her come back. We can work this out. Richard's right that she needs supervision." I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw a stranger. This wasn't the girl I'd raised. This was someone so deep under her husband's control that she couldn't see the truth even when it was destroying her own family. "No," I said simply. "I'm not returning her to that garage, and you can't make me." Richard's face went darker. "Well, see about that." He pulled out his phone and actually called the police right there in the hallway. I stood there and listened to him report that his elderly mother-in-law with dementia had been taken by her daughter against the family's wishes, and he wanted her returned for her own safety. When the police arrived 20 minutes later, I let them in and showed them everything. The photos of the garage, the bank statements, the medical report from Dr. Martinez. Mom came out of the bedroom, calm and clear-headed, and gave her statement that Shed left Bethany's house voluntarily because of the living conditions. The officers looked at Richard's documentation, looked at mine, and told us this was a civil matter that needed to be settled in court. They weren't going to forcibly remove an elderly woman who stated clearly that she wanted to be where she was. Richard was furious, but there was nothing he could do. After the police left, Richard played his next card. He brought Madison and Chase to my apartment, two innocent children who'd been coached to ask for their grandma back. Madison, with her big brown eyes and her mother's face, looked at me and said, "Aunt Claire, we miss Grandma Dot. Mom says she's sick and needs to come home." But then Chase, sweet 6-year-old Chase Hoad, always been the more observant of the two, asked a question that clearly wasn't part of the script. "Why did Grandma have to sleep in the cold garage?" I told Daddy it was mean, but he said she liked it. Richard's face went white. He grabbed Chase's hand and pulled him toward the door. "We're leaving. Claire, you'll be hearing from our lawyer." That lawyer's letter arrived 2 days later. Richard was suing for custody of my mother, claiming she was incompetent, and I was exploiting her for financial gain. The letter also threatened charges of elder abuse against me if I didn't immediately return Mom to Bethany's care. It was projection at its finest, accusing me of exactly what they'd been doing. Gloria assured me the lawsuit was baseless, but it would cost money and time to fight, and that was exactly what Richard wanted. He wanted to bleed me dry financially and emotionally until I gave up. He also filed a police report claiming Mom had been kidnapped, even though the responding officers had already determined Shed left voluntarily. Detective Wallace Crane from the Elder Abuse Unit called me in for an interview. I brought all my documentation, and Detective Crane listened carefully, took notes, and asked pointed questions about the garage living situation and the financial transactions. By the end of the interview, it was clear which direction his investigation was leaning, and it wasn't toward me. "Miss Bennett, I'm going to be honest with you. What you're describing sounds like a clear case of financial exploitation and elder abuse. I'm opening an official investigation into your daughter and son-in-law." Richard's next move was to try to turn my family against me. He called my brother Frank, my ex-husband Garrett, distant cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, and spun a story about how I was keeping Mom from her loving family out of spite and greed. Frank, who'd already shown his loyalty to Richard, actually called me to say I was causing unnecessary drama and that I needed to let Bethany and Richard handle Mom's care. When I pointed out that their care involved a garage and stolen money, Frank hung up on me. The worst betrayal came when I discovered that Bethany had blocked Mom's phone number. Mom tried to call Madison on her birthday, wanted to wish her granddaughter well, and the call wouldn't go through. I tried from my phone and Bethany answered, then immediately hung up when she heard my voice. Mom sat on my couch crying while social media lit up with photos from Madison's elaborate birthday party, a party that clearly cost thousands of dollars, possibly thousands of Mom's own dollars, and she hadn't even been invited. The stress was overwhelming. I had to take time off work to deal with lawyer appointments and court filings. My boss was understanding but warned me that I couldn't keep missing shifts indefinitely. Medical bills for Mom's checkup and prescriptions piled up because Bethany had dropped her from their insurance plan the moment she left the house. My own savings started to dwindle as I paid for groceries for 2 higher utility bills and glorious legal fees. There were nights I lay awake wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake, if I should have just left well enough alone, if fighting Richard was going to destroy me financially and emotionally. But then I'd look at Mom sleeping peacefully in a warm bed with a full stomach and proper medical care. And I knew I'd made the right choice. The only choice. Richard could come at me with all his money and all his manipulation, but he couldn't change the fundamental truth. What he and Bethany had done to my mother was wrong, and I was going to make sure everyone knew it. Richard's next assault came through social media, and it was devastatingly effective. He posted a long, emotional message on Facebook about how his beloved grandmother-in-law had been stolen by a family member who was exploiting her for money. He never mentioned my name specifically, but anyone who knew the family could read between the lines. He talked about how they'd opened their home to Dot, how they'd cared for her with love and patience despite her difficult behavior, and how it broke their hearts that someone would turn her against them. The post got hundreds of sympathetic comments and shares. Bethany shared it with her own tearful addition about how much she missed her mother, how worried she was about her grandmother, and how some people use elderly family members as pawns in their own petty grudges. She posted old photos of Mom with Madison and Chase, happy moments from before the garage, and painted a picture of a loving family torn apart by outside interference. People who'd known me for years started looking at me differently at church, at the grocery store, in my apartment building. The whispers followed me everywhere. Richard's mother, Patricia, flew in from California to add fuel to the fire. She was a wealthy woman in her early 60s, perfectly coiffed and dripping with diamonds, the kind of person who'd never been told no in her entire life. She showed up at my apartment with Bethany in tow and demanded to see Mom. When I refused to let them in without a court order, Patricia actually threatened to call Adult Protective Services and report me for elder abuse. "My son has been nothing but generous to that woman," she hissed through my closed door. "If you had any decency, you'd recognize that you're hurting her by keeping her from her family." The Adult Protective Services visit happened 3 days later. A tired-looking social worker named Keisha Abbott came to the apartment and interviewed both Mom and me separately. She inspected the living conditions, reviewed the medical reports, and asked detailed questions about our daily routine and Mom's care. At the end of the visit, she actually apologized. "Miss Bennett, I can see this report was filed in bad faith. Your mother is clearly well cared for here. I'm closing this case as unfounded, but the damage was done." The fact that APS had investigated me at all made people assume there must be some truth to Richard's accusations. Then the forged documents surfaced. Richard produced paperwork claiming that Mom had signed over the deed to her house to Bethany 5 years ago, which would make Bethany the legal owner and give her even more claim to managing Mom's affairs. Mom was baffled. "I never signed anything like that. I sold that house 4 years ago when your father died and put the money in savings." Gloria investigated and discovered that the signature had been notarized by a man named Trevor Walsh, who happened to be Richard's college roommate. The notarization date was backdated, and when Gloria dug deeper, she found evidence that the entire document was fabricated. Community pressure mounted from all sides. People at my church, people who'd known me for 20 years, started asking questions. Wasn't I being a little dramatic? Couldn't I work this out with Bethany privately? Why was I airing family business in court instead of handling it internally? Someone even suggested that maybe I was going through a difficult time after my divorce and projecting my anger onto Bethany's marriage. The implication that I was mentally unstable, that this was all in my head, made me want to scream. Meanwhile, Richard's smear campaign expanded beyond social media. He contacted neighbors from Mom's old street, people who'd known her for decades, and told them I was keeping her isolated and possibly stealing her money. He painted himself as the concerned family member trying to rescue an elderly woman from financial abuse, conveniently flipping the entire script. Some of those neighbors actually believed him. One woman, Helen Pritchard, thankfully did not. Helen called me and told me Shed heard Dot crying in the garage multiple times when Shed walked past Bethany's house. Shed wondered about it but hadn't wanted to interfere in family business. Now, she wanted to help. She agreed to give a statement to Detective Crane. The stress took a physical toll. I lost 12 pounds in 3 weeks. I developed stress headaches that made it hard to see. Mom noticed and felt guilty, kept saying maybe she should just go back to the garage to end all this trouble. I had to convince her every day that fighting this was worth it, that she deserved better, that what Richard and Bethany had done was criminal, and they needed to face consequences. Some days, I believed it. Other days, I wasn't so sure. The final blow in Richard's smear campaign came when he hired a PR firm. Suddenly, there were sympathetic articles on local community blogs about the challenges of elder care and the tragedy of families torn apart by miscommunication. Richard was quoted anonymously as a local family man struggling to do the right thing for his aging relative while facing false accusations. The articles never mentioned the garage, the stolen money, or the financial abuse. They painted a picture of a misunderstood caregiver being persecuted by an unstable family member. I started to understand why so many cases of elder abuse go unreported. Richard had money, connections, and the ability to control the narrative. He made himself look like the victim while I looked like the aggressor. And the most terrifying part was how effective it was. My own brother thought I was overreacting. My ex-husband called to tell me I was embarrassing myself. Even some of my coworkers at the dental office where I worked started treating me differently, like I was the problem. But Gloria kept fighting. She filed motion after motion, documented every lie Richard told, every forged document he produced, and built a case that was slowly, painfully, starting to turn the tide. Detective Crane's investigation was progressing, and Head told us privately that he believed charges would be filed. Trevor Walsh, the notary who had falsified documents, was starting to crack under pressure. And somewhere in Seattle, my son Marcus was finally starting to see through Richard's manipulation. I just had to hold on long enough for the truth to matter more than Richard's lies. Marcus called me on a Wednesday evening, 4 weeks after he'd brought Mom home. His voice sounded different, strained, like he'd been crying or shouting, or both. "I'm driving down this weekend. I need to see Grandma Dot myself." I didn't argue. I just said okay and told him we'd be here. When he arrived Saturday morning, he looked exhausted, like he'd been awake all night. He hugged Mom for a long time, and I watched her melt into his arms. This grandson had always been her favorite, even though she'd never admit it. Marcus was a tall man, 6'3" and broad-shouldered from his years playing college basketball. He had his father's build but my eyes, and right now those eyes were hard with anger as he looked at the photos he'd taken of the garage. He looked at the bank statements, the medical reports, the forged documents, and his jaw got tighter and tighter. "Why didn't you tell me it was this bad?" His voice was accusatory, hurt. "I did tell you. You said I was overreacting." That landed. He looked away, ashamed. "I thought Bethany wouldn't do something like this. I thought you were exaggerating because of your divorce stress." Marcus spent an hour with Mom, just the two of them, and I don't know what they talked about, but when he came out of that room his face was set with determination. "I'm going to Bethany's house. I'm going to see that garage myself, and I'm going to get answers." I warned him that Richard wouldn't let him in, that this might get ugly. But Marcus wasn't listening. He was already heading for the door, and there was something in his stride that reminded me of my father. A man who'd never backed down from doing what was right no matter the cost. Marcus showed up at Bethany's house unannounced, just as I had weeks before. Richard answered the door and tried to block his entrance. "This isn't a good time, Marcus. You should have called." Marcus pushed past him, not violently but firmly, using his size advantage. "I want to see the garage. Right now." Richard's face went red, but he couldn't physically stop Marcus without creating a scene in front of the neighbors who were starting to notice the commotion. Marcus walked through the house like he owned it, past the expensive furniture and the designer kitchen, straight to the garage door. What Marcus found there made his hands shake as he pulled out his phone and started recording. The camping cot was still there, rumpled and abandoned. Mom's few remaining belongings had been thrown into black trash bags and shoved into the corner like garbage. But what really got Marcus was the notebook he found tucked under the cot's thin mattress. It was Mom's journal, entries dating back 8 months, documenting every humiliation Richard had inflicted on her. There were pages and pages of it, written in her shaky handwriting. A record of psychological torture that made Marcus' vision blur with rage. He read entries about being told she was worthless, a burden, an embarrassment to the family. He read about being denied dinner with the family because Richard said her table manners were disgusting. He read about having to ask permission to use the bathroom and being made to wait until it was convenient for Richard to unlock the house. He read about holidays spent alone in the garage while the family celebrated inside. By the time he finished reading, Marcus was crying, something he'd only seen him do once before at his grandfather's funeral. Marcus found Bethany in the kitchen and cornered her there while Richard was still in the garage calling someone, probably his lawyer. "How could you?" Marcus' voice broke. "How could you do this to your own grandmother?" Bethany's response was to collapse. She slid down the kitchen cabinet and sat on the floor sobbing. "I didn't know it would be like this. Richard said it was temporary. He said she needed boundaries. He said if I didn't support him on this, he'd leave me and take the kids. I was afraid. I'm still afraid." Richard burst into the kitchen at that moment, and everything exploded. He saw Marcus with his phone out, realized he'd been recording, and went into a rage unlike anything Marcus had ever seen. He started screaming about privacy violations and trespassing, and threatening to have Marcus arrested. But Marcus, fueled by righteous anger and the evidence on his phone, didn't back down. He got right in Richard's face and said, "You're done. I'm taking this to the police, to a lawyer, to anyone who'll listen. You tortured my grandmother, and you stole from her. You're going to pay for every single thing you did." That's when Patricia showed up, Richard's mother, arriving at exactly the wrong moment. She walked into the kitchen and immediately started defending her son, attacking Bethany for being too weak to handle the situation, and threatening Marcus with lawsuits if he didn't delete that video immediately. She revealed something in her rant that even Marcus hadn't known. Richard had done this before. His own grandmother, Patricia's mother, had been placed in a substandard nursing facility and died there alone while Richard controlled her finances. Patricia had covered it up, paid off the facility, and made sure it never became public. The pattern of elder abuse ran deep. The confrontation ended with Marcus leaving, evidence secured, and a promise that this wasn't over. He went straight to Detective Crane's office and turned over everything he'd found: the journal, the garage photos, the video of Richard's rage, and the recording of Patricia admitting to a previous case of elder abuse that had been covered up. Detective Crane looked at Marcus with something like satisfaction and said, "Now we have what we need." Marcus also uncovered the truth about Frank. Our brother who'd sided with Richard had discovered that Frank owed Richard $30,000 from a business loan 3 years ago. Richard had been holding that debt over Frank's head, threatening to call it in if Frank didn't support his version of events. Frank's betrayal wasn't about believing Richard. It was about being financially trapped by him. When Marcus called Frank and laid out the truth, confronted him with evidence, and gave him a chance to do the right thing, Frank finally broke. He admitted had been wrong. He admitted he'd chosen money over morality. But he still didn't know if he could help because that debt owned him. Marcus came back to my apartment that night with fire in his eyes. He told me everything that had happened, and then he made a promise. "I'm going to make this right." Richard thought he could get away with this because we're all too afraid or too passive to fight him. But he doesn't know me. I've got resources. I've got time. And I'm not stopping until he's in prison and Grandma Dot gets every penny back that he stole. That night marked the beginning of the end for Richard's reign of terror. My son had entered the fight, and he was just getting started. Marcus took a month's leave from his tech job and moved into my apartment's living room, sleeping on the couch and turning my dining table into a war room. He hired a private investigator named Ramon Cordova, a former FBI agent who specialized in financial crimes and elder abuse cases. Ramon was a methodical man in his mid-40s who'd seen every kind of family betrayal imaginable and still managed to maintain his faith in justice. He started digging into Richard's background, and what he found was damning. Richard had a pattern. Ramon discovered that Richard's grandmother, Patricia's mother, had died 8 years ago in a nursing facility that was later shut down for violations. The woman had entered the facility with $70,000 in savings. When she died, her account had $300 in it. Richard had been her power of attorney, had systematically withdrawn funds for care expenses that were never properly documented. The facility had been complicit, accepting kickbacks for allowing Richard access. After her death, Patricia had paid the facility $20,000 in what the paperwork called a settlement, but was really hush money. Ramon also tracked down 3 former employees of that nursing facility who were willing to talk. They described Richard's grandmother living in conditions similar to what Mom had endured in the garage: neglect, isolation, and financial exploitation. One nurse, a woman named Carlotta Hughes, broke down crying as she described trying to report the abuse and being fired for her trouble. Patricia had made sure Carlotta never worked in elder care again, using her wealth and connections to blacklist her. Carlotta had kept copies of her incident reports, though, and she was ready to testify. The investigation into Trevor Walsh, the notary who'd certified forged documents, yielded results faster than anyone expected. When Ramon showed up at Trevor's door with evidence of the fraudulent notarization and explained the federal charges he could face, Trevor cracked immediately. He admitted that Richard had paid him $5,000 to backdate a signature on the property deed paperwork, had known it was illegal but convinced himself it was a victimless crime, that it was just a family helping each other out. Now facing the loss of his license and possible prison time, Trevor agreed to testify in exchange for immunity. Marcus obtained subpoenas for all of Bethany's and Richard's financial records. What the bank statements revealed was staggering. The theft from Mom's accounts had started not 6 months ago, not 18 months ago, but nearly 3 years ago, shortly after Richard had convinced Bethany to get power of attorney under the guise of helping with Mom's finances. The first withdrawals had been small, $500 here, $1,000 there, always with notes about care expenses or household help that were vague enough to seem legitimate. But over time, the amounts grew larger and the justifications grew thinner. The total theft wasn't $63,000, as Ed originally calculated. It was $82,000. Richard and Bethany had taken almost everything Mom had. The vacation to Hawaii had actually cost $18,000, not $12,000, and they'd used Mom's credit card to book it. The kitchen renovation had been $22,000, not $15,000. Madison's private school tuition had been paid for 2 years, not 1. Every major expense in Bethany's life had been funded by stealing from her grandmother. Ramon's investigation also tracked down Mom's jewelry. The wedding ring, the pearl necklace, the gold bracelet, all of it had been pawned at a shop in Beaverton 6 months ago. Bethany herself had walked into that shop and sold family heirlooms for $4,200. The pawn shop had security footage. It showed Bethany clearly, looking nervous but determined, haggling with the shop owner and walking out with cash. The items were still there, because the 90-day redemption period hadn't expired. They could be recovered if we paid the pawn price. Medical evidence supported our case in ways that made even hardened Detective Crane look angry. Dr. Martinez's geriatric evaluation of Mom had documented everything. The malnutrition that would take months to fully reverse, the vitamin D deficiency that had weakened her bones, the untreated arthritis that had caused unnecessary pain, and the psychological trauma that manifested as nightmares and anxiety attacks. Dr. Martinez wrote in her report that Mom's treatment constituted medical neglect and that the living conditions in the garage had been dangerous to her health. In her professional opinion, Mom had been at risk of serious illness or death if she'd remained there through the winter. Dr. Harper, another specialist Marcus brought in, conducted a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation of Mom. This was crucial because Richard's entire defense rested on claims that Mom was mentally incompetent. Dr. Harper spent 6 hours with Mom over 3 sessions, conducting cognitive tests, memory assessments, and evaluating her decision-making capacity. The results were clear. Dorothy Bennett was fully competent. She had no signs of dementia or cognitive impairment. She was sharp, aware, and perfectly capable of managing her own affairs. Dr. Harper's report destroyed Richard's medical claims completely. Detective Crane's investigation started pulling in statements from neighbors and witnesses. Helen Pritchard gave a detailed account of hearing Mom crying in the garage on multiple occasions. Another neighbor, Wade Thompson, reported seeing Richard berating Mom in the driveway, calling her names and telling her to get back in the garage before the neighbors saw her. A mail carrier named Jasmine Liu said she'd noticed Mom sneaking into the house late at night and had wondered about it but hadn't known who to report it to. Each witness statement added another brick to the case we were building. The case against Richard expanded beyond just elder abuse. Ramon discovered evidence of tax fraud. Head also claimed deductions for her medical expenses while simultaneously denying her proper medical care. The IRS was going to be very interested in Richard's creative accounting. Federal charges might be added to the state charges, which meant Richard could be looking at prison time measured in years, not months. The civil lawsuit took shape as well. Gloria filed on Mom's behalf seeking full restitution of the stolen funds, plus damages for pain and suffering, emotional distress, and punitive damages meant to punish Richard and Bethany for their actions. The initial filing asked for $350,000. Gloria explained that we'd likely get less, maybe half that, but starting high gave us room to negotiate and sent a message that we weren't backing down. Patricia, Richard's mother, became a target of the civil suit as well. Gloria argued that Patricia had aided and abetted the abuse by providing financial support to Richard while knowing about the situation. By threatening witnesses and by covering up Richard's previous elder abuse case with his grandmother, Patricia's wealth made her an attractive defendant, and Gloria was confident we could prove she'd been complicit in Richard's scheme. Marcus spent hours tracking down Richard's assets so we'd know where to collect if we won the lawsuit. Richard and Bethany's house had $300,000 in equity. Richard had a retirement account worth $120,000. They had 2 cars, life insurance policies, investment accounts. On paper, Richard looked successful, but Ramon's investigation showed that much of it was built on debt and stolen money. Richard had been living beyond his means for years, using Mom's money to maintain an illusion of wealth. Through it all, Bethany remained silent. Marcus tried to contact her multiple times, offering her a chance to cooperate and potentially reduce her legal exposure. She never responded. The only communication we got from her was through Richard's lawyer, a slick attorney named Preston Blackwood who specialized in defending white-collar criminals. Preston sent letters threatening countersuits, claiming malicious prosecution, and demanding we drop everything or face financial ruin. Gloria responded to each letter with more evidence, more witness statements, more documentation of the crimes his clients had committed. Preston eventually stopped responding. The breakthrough came when Ramon found Richard's biggest mistake. In his arrogance, Richard had been documenting his control over Mom's finances in email. Head sent messages to Bethany, detailing how much they'd taken from the old woman's account that month, discussing whether they could borrow more without anyone noticing, and even joking about how easy it was to manipulate someone who was too proud to ask for help. Those emails, recovered through legal discovery, were smoking guns that proved intent and consciousness of guilt. Richard knew exactly what he was doing, and had been stupid enough to write it down. After 6 weeks of investigation, Detective Crane called us to his office. He sat across from Marcus, Gloria, Mom, and me, with a file folder that must have been 3 inches thick. "We have enough," he said. "The DA is filing charges: criminal elder abuse, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, forgery, fraud, and criminal threatening. Richard Sullivan is going to be arrested." Mom started crying. Marcus put his arm around her. I felt something loosen in my chest. A tension I'd been carrying for so long. I'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. Justice was coming. Finally, Richard was arrested on a Tuesday morning at his office. Marcus made sure to be there with his phone, recording as police walked Richard out in handcuffs in front of his coworkers. The video went viral in our local community, a reversal of Richard's social media smear campaign. Suddenly, people were seeing him for what he really was: a criminal in an expensive suit who'd tortured an elderly woman for money. The arrest made the local news. Prominent local businessman charged with elder abuse read the headline. Richard posted bail within 6 hours. Patricia paid $50,000 to get her son out of jail. But the conditions of his release included a restraining order. He had to stay 500 feet away from Mom, me, and Marcus. He was forbidden from contacting any witnesses in the case. His passport was surrendered. For the first time in this entire nightmare, Richard's freedom was restricted. He was facing real consequences, and his carefully constructed facade of respectability was crumbling. Preston Blackwood went into overdrive, trying to save his client. He held a press conference painting Richard as a victim of overzealous prosecution and family drama. He claimed the charges were based on misunderstandings and that Richard had only been trying to help his grandmother-in-law. The press conference backfired when a reporter asked why Richard had kept Mom in a garage if he was trying to help her. Preston stammered, claimed the garage was comfortably appointed, and the clip of his defensive response played on local news that night, alongside photos of the actual garage that Marcus had leaked to the media. Richard's desperation manifested in increasingly erratic behavior. He violated the restraining order within 48 hours of his release by driving past my apartment slowly, 3 times in one evening. A neighbor who had been following the case recognized him and called the police. Richard was arrested again. This time the judge denied bail, citing Richard as a flight risk and a danger to the victims. Richard would sit in county jail until his trial. Patricia was furious, screaming at the judge about bias and persecution until the bailiff threatened to hold her in contempt. From jail, Richard tried to intimidate witnesses. He called Helen Pritchard from a jail phone and tried to convince her to change her statement, promising her money if she'd been mistaken about hearing Mom crying. Helen recorded the call and turned it over to Detective Crane. Another charge was added: witness tampering. Richard's lawyer advised him to stop making phone calls, but Richard couldn't help himself. He was a man accustomed to controlling everything, and the loss of that control was making him reckless. Preston Blackwood attempted to negotiate a plea deal. He approached Gloria with an offer. Richard would plead guilty to reduced charges, pay back $50,000, and serve 2 years probation with no jail time. Gloria took the offer to Mom, Marcus, and me. We discussed it for about 30 seconds before unanimously rejecting it. No deal, Gloria told Preston. Your client is going to trial, and he's going to prison. He can make this easier on himself by pleading guilty to the original charges, but we're not negotiating down. Patricia launched her own campaign to save her son. She hired a public relations firm to scrub the internet of negative stories about Richard. She paid for ads in local papers about the importance of family privacy and the dangers of false accusations. She tried to use her wealth and social connections to pressure the DA into dropping charges. None of it worked. The evidence was too strong, the witnesses too credible, and the DA wasn't someone who could be intimidated by money. Bethany filed for divorce. The petition was filed quietly, without press attention, but Gloria found out about it through court monitors. Bethany was trying to distance herself from Richard before the trial, protecting herself and her assets. She moved with Madison and Chase to a friend's house across town. She froze the joint bank accounts. She filed for full custody of the children. Richard, sitting in jail, found out about the divorce through his lawyer and reportedly threw a chair in the meeting room. The guards put him in solitary for 24 hours. The civil lawsuit moved forward on a parallel track. Gloria filed for summary judgment, arguing that the evidence was so overwhelming that a trial wasn't even necessary. The judge agreed to an expedited schedule. Patricia tried to settle, offering $100,000 to make the civil case go away. Gloria countered with $275,000 and a public apology. Patricia refused. She was willing to pay money, but she wouldn't admit her son had done anything wrong. We were going to trial on both the criminal and civil cases. Richard's 7th betrayal came from an unexpected source. Trevor Walsh, the notary who'd already agreed to testify, revealed that Richard had tried to hire him to forge more documents from jail. Richard had called Trevor's brother and offered him $20,000 to have Trevor change his testimony. Trevor's brother, a more ethical man than Trevor himself, had recorded the conversation and brought it to the police. Another charge: conspiracy to commit perjury. Richard's hole just kept getting deeper. Frank, my brother, finally found his conscience. The weight of knowing he'd sided with Richard against his own mother became too much. He called Marcus and confessed everything. Richard had loaned him $30,000 and had been using that debt to control him, threatening to demand immediate repayment if Frank didn't support Richard's version of events. Frank offered to testify about Richard's manipulation tactics, about how Richard had cultivated financial dependence in people to control them. It was too little, too late to repair our relationship, but it would be useful in court. Garrett, my ex-husband, also got pulled into the mess. Ramon's investigation discovered that Richard had been paying Garrett to provide negative character testimony about me. Richard had planned to have Garrett testify that I was unstable, vindictive, and motivated by jealousy of Bethany's successful marriage. Ramon confronted Garrett with bank records showing 3 payments of $5,000 each. Faced with potential perjury charges, Garrett came clean and agreed to testify about Richard's attempt to manipulate the case. The children, Madison and Chase, became part of a child welfare investigation. Social workers interviewed them separately about what they'd seen and heard in their home. Madison, now old enough to understand some of what had happened, told her social worker that Shed felt sad about Grandma Dot being cold in the garage. Chase said his daddy had told him Grandma smelled bad and couldn't be in the house. The social worker, Keisha Abbott, documented signs that the children had been taught to devalue elderly people and recommended family therapy. Her report would be used in custody proceedings and potentially in the criminal trial. Richard made his biggest mistake from jail when he wrote a letter to the judge, hearing his case. In the letter, Richard argued that he was being persecuted for making difficult but necessary decisions about an elderly person who was a burden on society. He wrote that people needed to stop being so sentimental about the elderly and recognize that they consumed resources that could better be used on younger generations. The letter was shocking in its callousness and its honesty. It revealed Richard's true beliefs, that some people, by virtue of age or disability, were simply worth less than others. The judge read the letter into the court record at the next hearing. Preston Blackwood looked like he wanted to die. Public opinion shifted dramatically. The same people who'd believed Richard's initial social media campaign now saw the evidence accumulating against him. The garage photos circulated widely. Mom's journal entries were quoted in news articles. People who'd defended Richard started deleting their supportive comments. The church that Bethany and Richard attended released a statement saying they were praying for all involved, but didn't condone the actions described in the charges. Richard was now a pariah, sitting in jail and watching his life disintegrate around him. The preliminary hearing took place on a cold January morning in the Multnomah County Courthouse. The courtroom was packed with reporters, curious onlookers, and supporters. Mom sat between Marcus and me, dressed in a simple blue dress, her hands folded in her lap. She looked small and fragile but determined. Across the aisle, Patricia sat alone in the gallery, wearing expensive jewelry and an expression of barely contained rage. Bethany wasn't there. Shed sent word through her lawyer that she wouldn't attend. Richard was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed in front of him. Head lost weight in jail, and his face had taken on a gray pallor, but his eyes still held that calculating look, like he was trying to figure out how to spin this situation to his advantage. Judge Leonard Vaughn, a stern man in his early 60s with no tolerance for games, called the hearing to order and asked the prosecution to present their case. DA Simone Torres, a sharp woman in her mid-40s who'd built her career prosecuting white-collar crime, stood and outlined the charges methodically. She presented bank statements showing the systematic theft. She showed photos of the garage that made people in the gallery gasp. She played portions of the video Marcus had recorded of Richard's rage. She introduced medical reports documenting the harm done to Mom's health. Each piece of evidence landed like a hammer blow. Trevor Walsh testified first, describing in detail how Richard had paid him $5,000 to backdate a notarized signature on forged property documents. He looked ashamed, kept his eyes down, but his testimony was clear and damning. Preston Blackwood tried to discredit him in cross-examination, pointing out that Trevor was testifying to save himself from charges, but Trevor held firm. "I did wrong," he said, "but I'm not going to compound it by lying now. Richard Sullivan paid me to commit fraud, and that's what I did." Helen Pritchard testified next, describing the multiple times Shed heard Mom crying in the garage and seen Richard shoving her toward the garage door. Shed felt guilty for not intervening earlier, she said, but she hadn't wanted to get involved in what she thought was a family matter. Now she knew better. Her testimony was emotional and credible. Preston tried to suggest she was misremembering or exaggerating, but Helen wouldn't budge. She knew what Shed'd seen and heard. Wade Thompson, the neighbor who'd witnessed Richard berating Mom, testified about an incident where Richard had called Mom worthless and a leech in their shared driveway. Had been shocked by the vitriol in Richard's voice, he said. It wasn't the tone of someone frustrated with a difficult family member. It was the tone of someone who genuinely hated the person he was speaking to. Preston tried to paint Wade as someone with an axe to grind against Richard over an unrelated property dispute, but Wade calmly explained that his testimony had nothing to do with property lines and everything to do with witnessing abuse. Dr. Martinez testified about Mom's medical condition when Id first brought her in for evaluation. She described the malnutrition, the untreated health conditions, the psychological trauma. She stated unequivocally that Mom had been a victim of medical neglect and that the living conditions in the garage had been dangerous to her health. Preston asked if it was possible Mom had declined proper medical care on her own. Dr. Martinez looked at him like he was an idiot and said, "Not when someone else controlled her finances and access to the house where her medications were kept." The moment that changed everything came when Bethany was called to testify. A murmur went through the courtroom. Everyone thought Shed invoked spousal privilege and refused to testify against Richard. But Bethany walked into the courtroom looking pale and exhausted, took the witness stand, and swore to tell the truth. Richard stared at her with an expression that would have been intimidating if there weren't armed bailiffs in the room. D.A. Torres started with simple questions. When had Mom come to live with them? When had she been moved to the garage? Who made that decision? Bethany answered in a small voice, confirming the timeline, admitting that Richard had insisted on the garage arrangement. Then Preston Blackwood took over for cross-examination, and he was aggressive. He tried to get Bethany to say that Mom had been difficult, that the garage had been adequately heated, that the family had done their best under challenging circumstances. Bethany started to answer the way Preston wanted, giving halting responses that supported Richard's narrative. But something in her broke. Maybe it was seeing Mom sitting there looking at her with sad, forgiving eyes. Maybe it was the weight of 6 months of guilt. Maybe it was finally being free enough from Richard's control to tell the truth. Whatever it was, Bethany suddenly stopped mid-sentence and said, "I can't do this anymore." The courtroom went silent. Judge Vaughn leaned forward. "Miss Sullivan, are you all right?" Bethany shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, Your Honor, I'm not all right. None of this is all right. Everything, Mr. Blackwood is trying to get me to say is a lie. My husband hurt my grandmother. He stole from her. He put her in that garage and he made me go along with it by threatening to leave me and take my children. I was too afraid to stop him. I let this happen. I'm guilty too." Richard exploded. He jumped to his feet, screaming at Bethany, calling her a liar and a traitor, and worse things that the judge immediately ordered stricken from the record. The bailiffs grabbed Richard and forced him back into his chair. He kept screaming, his face purple with rage, while Patricia stood in the gallery shouting that Bethany was lying to save herself. Judge Vaughn slammed his gavel down hard and threatened to clear the courtroom. The bailiffs moved toward Patricia, who finally sat down but continued glaring at Bethany with pure hatred. Judge Vaughn held Richard in contempt of court and added 30 days to whatever sentence he might receive. Then he looked at Bethany with something like pity and asked her if she wanted to continue her testimony. She nodded and spent the next hour telling the truth. She described how Richard had gradually isolated Mom, how Head convinced Bethany that Mom was becoming a burden, how the garage arrangement had started as temporary but become permanent. She admitted signing off on financial transactions that she knew were questionable. She described living in fear of Richard's temper and his threats. By the time she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom, except for Richard's and Patricia's. Judge Vaughn heard closing arguments briefly from both sides, and then made his ruling. There was probable cause to believe Richard Sullivan had committed all the crimes charged. The case would be bound over for trial. Richard would remain in custody without bail. All stolen funds and property were to be returned immediately to Dorothy Bennett. The judge looked at Richard with undisguised disgust and said, "Mr. Sullivan, in my 30 years on the bench, I have rarely seen a case as clear-cut or as disturbing as this one. You systematically abused and exploited a vulnerable elderly woman for your own financial gain. You will answer for these crimes." The criminal charges were finalized. Elder abuse in the first degree, criminal mistreatment, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, theft in the first degree, forgery, criminal threatening, and witness tampering. If convicted on all counts, Richard faced 8 to 12 years in prison. Preston Blackwood announced his intention to fight the charges at trial, but his heart clearly wasn't in it anymore. Head seen the evidence, and Head watched his client lose control in open court. He knew this was unwinnable. On the civil side, Gloria filed her summary judgment motion with the full record from the criminal hearing attached. The evidence was overwhelming. Patricia's lawyers tried to fight it, arguing that Patricia herself hadn't committed any crimes and shouldn't be held liable for her son's actions. Gloria countered with evidence of Patricia's active participation in covering up Richard's previous elder abuse case and her attempts to intimidate witnesses in this case. The judge ruled that the civil trial would proceed and that Patricia would remain a defendant. Marcus and I walked out of that courthouse with Mom between us, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. Wed won this round. Richard was in jail where he belonged. The truth was finally being heard. We still had trials ahead of us, both criminal and civil, but the hardest part was over. Wed stood up to a bully with money and connections and lawyers, and Wed proven that justice could still prevail. 6 months passed between the preliminary hearing and the trial. Richard's defense team tried every legal maneuver to delay or dismiss the charges, but Judge Vaughn wasn't having it. The trial lasted a week. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. They found Richard guilty on every single count. When the verdict was read, Patricia let out a wail like a wounded animal and had to be escorted from the courtroom. Richard stood there expressionless, like his brain couldn't process that Head actually lost. The sentencing hearing came 2 weeks later. Mom was allowed to give a victim impact statement. She stood at the podium, this tiny woman who'd survived so much, and spoke in a steady voice about what Richard had done to her. She talked about the cold nights in the garage, about the humiliation of asking permission to use the bathroom, about watching her savings disappear and feeling powerless to stop it. She talked about the psychological damage, the nightmares, the shame of being treated as worthless by her own family. When she finished, she looked directly at Richard and said, "I forgive you, because holding on to anger would only hurt me more. But I hope you use your time in prison to become a better person, because right now, you are not." Judge Vaughn sentenced Richard to 10 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for at least 5. He ordered full restitution of $82,000, plus $45,000 in damages for pain and suffering. Patricia was sitting in the gallery, stone-faced, knowing that she'd have to liquidate assets to cover the judgment. Trevor Walsh lost his notary license permanently and received 3 years probation. Frank agreed to pay victim restitution as part of his cooperation agreement. The criminal case was over, and justice had been served. The civil trial was almost anticlimactic, with Richard's criminal conviction on the record, proving the civil case was straightforward. The jury awarded Mom $240,000 in damages, split between Richard and Patricia. Patricia's lawyers tried to appeal, but the judgment was upheld. She paid under protest, her fortune significantly reduced, her reputation in tatters. She moved back to California shortly after, unable to face the social consequences of what her son had done and her role in enabling it. Mom's recovery took time, but she made remarkable progress. Living permanently with me in a larger 2-bedroom apartment we'd found together, she gained back the weight she'd lost and more. Her color returned, her smile came back. She rejoined her church, reconnected with old friends she'd lost touch with during the garage months, and started attending a support group for elder abuse survivors run by a local nonprofit. She still had nightmares sometimes, but they became less frequent. Therapy helped. So did time and safety and love. Bethany's journey was harder and more complicated. Her divorce from Richard was finalized quickly. She got full custody of Madison and Chase, with Richard's parental rights restricted to supervised visits after his release from prison. She found work as a teacher's aide at a public school, making far less than she'd been accustomed to, but building independence for the first time in her adult life. She started therapy to address the years of emotional abuse and control she'd endured in her marriage. The relationship between Bethany and Mom healed slowly, carefully, with professional help. They met in family therapy sessions mediated by a counselor who specialized in family trauma. Mom had forgiven Bethany, but forgiveness didn't mean forgetting or pretending nothing had happened. Boundaries were established. Trust had to be rebuilt. Bethany moved with the children into a modest apartment and worked hard to provide a stable life for them. Mom saw the grandchildren regularly, and those relationships blossomed as Madison and Chase came to understand that their grandma was safe and loved and part of their lives again. Marcus became Mom's legal guardian and power of attorney, a role he took seriously. He established a trust fund for her care using the restitution money, invested carefully to ensure she'd be comfortable for the rest of her life. He visited once a month, flying down from Seattle, and he and Mom grew closer than they'd ever been. He told me once that saving Mom had saved him too, had reminded him what mattered in life beyond career and money. Frank attempted redemption by paying back every penny of the $30,000 Richard had loaned him, taking out a loan against his 401k to do it. He apologized to Mom in person, a painful conversation where he admitted he'd chosen money over morality and nearly cost her everything. Mom accepted his apology, but their relationship remained strained. Some betrayals left permanent marks. Still, Frank's testimony about Richard's manipulation tactics had been valuable at trial, and that counted for something. Ramon's investigation had recovered all of Mom's jewelry from the pawn shop. We paid the redemption price and got everything back. Mom wore her wedding ring again with tears in her eyes, touching it like she couldn't believe it was real. She gave the pearl necklace to me as a thank you, though I told her I didn't need thanks for doing what was right. The gold bracelet she put aside for Madison, to be given to her granddaughter on her 18th birthday, with a letter explaining what it meant and what she'd survived. The case garnered enough attention that I started speaking at local senior centers about warning signs of elder abuse. I talked about how it could happen in families that looked perfect from the outside, how financial abuse was often hidden behind the veneer of helping, and how important it was to stay connected to elderly family members and watch for signs of isolation or exploitation. Helen Pritchard started a neighborhood watch program focused on checking in on vulnerable elderly residents. The community had learned hard lessons from Mom's case. Madison and Chase, with the help of therapy, began to understand what had happened in age-appropriate ways. Madison, now 9, wrote Mom a letter that said, "I'm sorry I didn't know how to help you when you were in the garage. I was little, but I should have told someone. I love you and am glad you're safe now." Chase, now 7, drew pictures from Mom's apartment, mostly of families holding hands and smiling. They were learning about respect, compassion, and standing up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. The cycle of devaluing the elderly that Richard had taught them was being broken. Claire, which is me, learned lessons too. I learned that family loyalty has limits, that protecting an abuser doesn't help anyone, and that sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same thing. I learned that I was stronger than I'd thought, that I could stand up to intimidation and manipulation and lies. My relationship with Bethany was complicated, probably would be forever, but we were working on it. She was my daughter, and she'd made terrible choices, but she'd also been a victim of Richard's control. Life wasn't simple. One evening in late summer, Mom and I sat on the balcony of our apartment watching the sun set over Portland. She'd been quiet all day, thoughtful. Finally, she said, "You know what I learned from all this?" I asked her what. "I learned that family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up when you're living in a cold garage with nowhere else to turn. You showed up. Marcus showed up. That's real family." I squeezed her hand, and we sat there in comfortable silence as the sky turned orange and purple. Mom talked about rebuilding her life at 80 years old. She'd started taking a watercolor painting class at the senior center. She'd made friends with other women her age, who'd survived their own traumas. She had hope again, plans for the future, joy in small things. We were planning a trip to the coast for the following month, just the two of us, to stay in a bed and breakfast and watch the ocean. It felt like freedom. Thanksgiving arrived. 1 year after Eid found Mom in that garage. We gathered in my apartment, which was too small for everyone, but we made it work. Mom, Marcus, me, Bethany, Madison, and Chase. Patricia wasn't there. Richard definitely wasn't there, serving year 1 of his 10-year sentence. His absence wasn't mentioned because he'd become irrelevant to our lives. We'd taken back our family from his toxic influence. Mom led grace before the meal, her voice strong and sure. She thanked God for second chances and children who fight for justice. She thanked him for healing and hope and family that stood together in the hardest times. Madison asked Mom to tell stories about when I was little, and Mom launched into embarrassing tales that made everyone laugh. The apartment was crowded and the meal was simple, but it was filled with love and connection and the knowledge that we'd survived something terrible and come out stronger. Looking back, I see how close we came to losing Mom entirely. If I hadn't gone to Bethany's house that night, if I hadn't looked in the garage, if Id believed Richard's lies and walked away. Mom might not have survived the winter. She might have died in that cold space, alone and forgotten, another elderly person who slipped through the cracks of a system that should have protected her. But she didn't die. She survived, and now she was thriving. The lesson I want everyone to take from this story is simple. Elder abuse happens in nice families, in nice neighborhoods, behind closed doors and pleasant facades. It's hidden by shame and isolation and financial manipulation. The warning signs are there if you know to look for them. Sudden changes in living conditions, isolation from friends and family, unexplained financial transactions, physical decline, and fear of a particular person. If you see these signs in your own family or in someone you know, speak up, report it. Don't assume someone else will handle it. Be the person who shows up. As we cleaned up after Thanksgiving dinner, Marcus pulled me aside and said, "You saved her life, you know. If you hadn't acted when you did, none of us would be here right now." I shook my head. We saved her. All of us together. That's how it works. That's what family means. And I meant it. My son had found me finding my mother in that garage. What he did next didn't just freeze my son-in-law in fear of consequences. It freed us all from silence, complicity, and the lie that abuse is ever acceptable when it happens to someone we love. Now I want to ask you something. Have you ever witnessed elder abuse in your own family or community? Have you seen warning signs and wondered if you should say something? Drop your thoughts in the comments below because these conversations matter. They save lives. And if this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel so we can keep spreading awareness about elder abuse. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Together, we can break the silence that allows abuse to continue. Thank you for listening to Mom's story, to our story. And I wish you all the strength to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard, even when it costs you something, because that's when it matters most.